obviously this event itself is a broader two-day event featuring multiple workshops. This particular one is focusing on how to build a modern SOC. The whole series is designed to be able to upskill, inspire SOC leaders to be able to build as well as optimize their security operations centers. So we've really created this masterclass event to bring together security leaders as well as test their knowledge. So as part of this session, for this particular one, we're covering how to build a modern SOC. And I'd like to start by introducing our very well respected and very welcomed guest, Chris Crowley, the instructor of the SANS survey, which is much anticipated this year, I believe. So Chris, would you like to start off with introductions?
Sure. Yeah. Just let me introduce myself real quickly. I do a bunch of different things. I work as a consultant independently, consult with people on their security operations centers. I teach for the SANS Institute. I've been teaching at SANS for years. I've been a certified instructor for about 10 years as part of SANS Institute, and currently a senior instructor there. I teach my own class on how to design, build, and operate a security operations center. And so a bunch of things I've actually pulled out of that in order to talk about building a modern SOC in this. And the last thing you mentioned was the SOC survey. So this is something that I've written for the last 5 years, with the SANS Institute, and one of the years on my own. This is something that is intended to be a nice wrap up of information for people. And, thanks to CyberProof for participating in that in terms of as a sponsor. And I just did the first webcast associated with that survey, and that has now been released and is available for download. And I'm going to cherry pick a couple of details out of that survey from this year, especially to talk about a couple of the things that are changing. So that's me in brief. You can find me online pretty easily if you search for me. So just today's talk, I want to talk a little bit about an overall survey view of all of the different stuff that it takes in order to actually build and manage and operate an effective security operations center. So that's the plan for today, kind of cherry picking a couple of piece parts. Realize that there's a lot of additional details that go into this, but we're trying to give you all of the things that you would need in order to be really smart. And speaking of being really smart, there is actually a quiz. And so there will be a quiz at the end. We're going to do this where Ben is going to actually run a quiz at the end. So in order to join this quiz, you'll need to go to this kahoot.it. And then when you get to the kahoot.it, you're going to need to put in the pin for this specific quiz. The pin is 2548431, and I believe that Ben just put it into the chat if you want to copy paste it so you don't typo it into the window. So anything else sort of prefatory, Ben, before I get going on some of the other details?
No, absolutely not. Over to you.
All right, great. So first thing I want to talk a little bit about is the SOC survey. I think that this is something that every year that I've written it, after I've written it, people have come back to me and said, this is amazing. Thank you so much. I was able to take this, go talk to my management, explain what some of the things are that other people are doing, and then be able to actually deliver that. So this is a survey that we've written for 5 years. Starting last year, and it is going to happen again this year, it actually is something where I released all of the data, of course, de-identified, because there was stuff where people gave their names and email addresses and stuff. And so that's not released, obviously. But so, this is something that every year, in addition to people saying, thank you very much, I usually get questions like, hey, well, we're based in South America, and I'm trying to get an understanding of what other people in South America who have more than 500 people as analysts are doing. And it's sort of like, well, I didn't answer that question specifically, but I always had this sense of wanting people to be able to answer their own questions. So that Jupyter notebook from 2020 is actually already released. And I will be releasing the de-identified data from this survey as well eventually this year. And the idea is to try to empower people to answer their own questions, because a lot of times people are asking very specific questions focused on something that they want to know. The answer is oftentimes in that response set somewhere. So in thinking about who these people are, we have a lot of people largely headquartered out of North America, but operations globally. They tend to be smaller organizations. They tend not to be very, very large organizations, but this is the data set that we have. Also, the people tend to be more analyst manager type roles of the SOC, as opposed to say like a CISO, or as opposed to like the junior level kind of intern sort of person. So one thing that I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, and you're probably aware of it, but I want to reinforce it in the information that we're actually expressing here, is the big change that I saw coming up next year is that it's not just IT that's moving to the cloud at an increasing pace. It's your security operations centers. And so this particular graphic represents an answer to a question. And what we said in this question was basically, what's the architecture of your SOC? And currently the most common response is a centralized single security operations center. And I've seen lots of different structures and architectures that people are using, but this is a common one. Everyone sits in the same location. All the data is aggregated back to the central location where that monitoring occurs. Okay. But something that if you just look at the far left-hand side of this chart, as you're looking at it, the 65 number, the red represents the anticipated change in architecture going into the next year. And so this is the cloud-based SOC services are listed as the architecture that people are anticipating that they will be changing to in the next year. And it's not quite double the current position of this, but this is the cloud-based SOC services, is that the SOC itself, the infrastructure, the systems which are managing the SOC are moving out to the cloud. So if you're not already aware of this trend, and if your management isn't putting pressure on you to do this currently, this may be coming. So think about it and think about how you would do that. Additionally, my advice to you as you're thinking about how you would do that is to think about how you could optimize for performance. Think about how you could optimize for your staffing. Think about how you could optimize technology selection. Think about how you could optimize your operational capability if you go through such a massive architectural change.
Well, Chris, what exactly would you define as a cloud-based SOC? Because there's, I guess, different variations you could associate with being what a cloud-based SOC service is. Would you say a SIM in the cloud, native to the cloud, and then having processes around that, or a SIM with processes that are native to the cloud?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I actually think that I could come up with about 4 or 5 different iterations, but you mentioned the key element that I think will be there is the majority of the data processing of the collected information will be in some sort of an externally hosted system. And again, like SIM is probably the technology that's that, but it actually doesn't need to be necessarily just the SIM. What I see, and I'm going to get to technology later and talk about it, but I'm not going to talk about it exactly through the cloud lens. So it's a good question to think about now. But what I see as the cloud native architecture is all of your data correlation, whatever technology that takes the form of, all of your orchestration, automation, tasking from a procedural aspect. So this is usually a SOAR, but again, it doesn't need to be. And in addition to that, all of your communications for your SOC capability. So if you have still, your email on-prem, if you have your chat and so on-prem, then I kind of feel like you haven't really gone cloud native. But if you're operating your email entirely in a cloud environment, if all of your ticketing's in the cloud environment, if all of your chat and video conferencing and interaction software and infrastructure is hosted by somebody else, at that point, I feel like you're cloud native, right? And again, there are some companies that this is not a good fit for, and it never will be a good fit for. I've worked in places where, in order to even get close to the building, my automobile that I'm driving in goes through 2 iterations of physical security checks, and there are people walking around with guns at the gate and all that stuff. Usually not a cloud native inclined kind of organization where I've got biometrics to get through 3 doors in order to get to the physical SOC that I'm going to go work in. So I'm not saying it's good for everybody, but for a lot of people who don't have those sorts of physical security requirements, this becomes a value proposition that's pretty easy to see from their management. Yeah.
Sure, thanks.
So that's one aspect of architecture. There are a couple of other aspects of architecture that I want to talk about. So I talk about this from a functional perspective, the functional areas of a security operations center. And this listing that I cite is steering committee, command center, monitoring capability, threat intelligence capability, incident handling capability, forensic analysis capability, and self-assessment. And oftentimes, as soon as I show this, there are all sorts of questions. People are saying, well, I don't do this or I don't do that. And so just realize that when I talk about functional areas of a SOC, I'm talking about capabilities and not necessarily the way that you organize your staffing inside of the SOC. And I'm also going to talk about that organization. Just give me one moment for that. I usually think about this from the perspective of, let's sort of draw a parallel to a building, right? Or a house, right? We all generally have a perspective on what entails a house. And most of the time you would assume that if you have a house, you're going to have internal electricity and internal plumbing. You don't have to have electricity and plumbing, and it still could be a house, right? I mean, I can go look at something that was built 100 years ago and see that doesn't have plumbing, and the plumbing or the resources that we use for waste disposal are elsewhere, or we assume that the kitchen's inside, but older houses have kitchens outside because of the risk of fire, right? So there are all these elements that are actually necessary, and the way that you manage and deploy and operate them depends on the needs of your organization. And the last thing, I feel like most of these labels are self-evident, but the last thing I want to mention is that steering committee. The steering committee is actually comprised of, or should be comprised of, the people who I refer to as your constituents. These are the people who you're protecting. And this becomes the official manner of interaction with your constituents. That steering committee becomes a bi-directional communication vehicle in order to say, here's how we're doing, here's what we're seeing, as well as for them to say, here's how we're doing. Business is great. We need to expand into 14 new countries. Or, hey, we're having all these problems and we need your help with this. Or, hey, we're having all these problems and we think that you're causing them. And so you need to address that. Or, hey, you're not meeting the metrics. Or this, there should be some defined avenue of bidirectional communication from this, from the SOC and to the SOC. And I call this the steering committee. One other thing that there really needs to be good interaction with is your IT operations. Your IT operations is a critically necessary partner for your security operations. And in the survey, in the SOC survey, we asked the question, what is your SOC's relationship to your NOC? And so the top answer is our SOC and NOC teams work together only when there are emergencies, right? So only when there's an emergency are they going to actually come together and do something. And again, the next most popular one is that we have an integrally, sort of established operational procedure. So I like to ask people to think about it in these terms. Your SOC provides oversight of your IT operations, right? So that's one thing that you get out of this. And the more oversight you want to have, the more distance you want to impose between the SOC and the NOC, right? Because the SOC and the NOC can actually coordinate with one another. When I say coordination, I mean this is separation of duties and responsibilities, but direct interactions of tasking, ticketing, and perhaps even sort of team-based operations together. And then there's the idea of the SOC and the NOC being embedded together. And I've helped people to design this where it's all the same thing and all the same resource. And of course, the closer you get to an embedded strategy, the more coordination that's occurring, but the less oversight that you're able to accomplish when you're directly embedded. And we can tell our IT staff, you have cybersecurity responsibility and you have all these things that you need to do. The only problem with that is that if we don't then do all the extra work to train them and make sure that we're watching that they're actually doing this stuff, we lose that. We lose that cybersecurity essence. I think that the convergence of this IT and security is inevitable at some point in the future for every organization, but I also see a pathway where they're usually bound together at the beginning, and then they're separated, usually so that the security capabilities can gain maturity and actually gain the right sort of visibility and support and awareness of management. And then there's actually a reconvergence later. And so it surprises me every year when people say, no, we don't really do much of this, because I think that this is something that needs to be on the pathway. And this is something architectural. I think that it's important that you make sure that there's a very effective, coordinated capability between your IT and your cybersecurity operations. So in terms of making this to where you're effective at doing this work, usually people can't afford to have every single capability internal to the Security Operations Center. So one of the questions that we asked in the survey was, what do you do, first of all? But then in that question, embedded in the question was, what do you do that is only internal? What do you do that is both internal and you've outsourced part of it? And then the other part is, what is the stuff that you do that is only outsourced? And so this particular chart, which again is from the 2021 SOC survey, is something that represents on the light tan here, outsourced only. The middle row is basically an orange color, is the company or the respondent both outsourced it and does it internally. And so you see here pen testing, if you add the combined outsourced only and both, you see that this is sort of head and shoulders above every other response for pen testing is both outsourced and both. And so there are a lot of details in here. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but general sort of trend, and this is persistent over the last 5 years that I've written this survey: pen testing, threat intelligence, and forensics, a very commonly outsourced capability. And my understanding derived from this in terms of outsourcing is you can essentially embody one of two paradigms. The first paradigm is you follow the crowd. Everybody else is doing it, so why don't we? And it's a perfectly reasonable paradigm, because if everybody else is doing it, there's probably some essence to that decision that makes sense. But then there's the other paradigm, which is tenet nosum, know thyself. This idea of, we know what we do well, and we're going to outsource the other things. And in some cases, following the crowd would be a mistake for you, because you've already developed a capability that works really well for your organization, and you'd be losing all of that effort that you've already developed. And so I'm going to go to the outsourcing of monitoring and detection in a moment, because this is one that's kind of an even split. And so I want to talk about this in just a moment, sort of in more detail. But
and Chris, how would you
yeah.
know which approach to take when, you mentioned previously that there are some occasions where you may use the follow the crowd approach versus the know thyself approach. Are there specific scenarios in which you would choose one versus the other? Is it due to level of maturity or?
Yeah, my guidance is this. My guidance is figure out what you do really well. Okay? Figure out what you do really well and decide, do I need more of that? Okay. If you do need more of it, what I would suggest is basically find external partners that can fill in the gaps that you have. If you don't think that you do something really well, outsource it like that, and then look to the things that other people are outsourcing in order to address that. So let me actually just mention the idea of monitoring here. What I see in monitoring is a lot of people monitoring a part of this. And usually it's the tier one sort of level perspective of this, where you push the initial decision over to the managed security service provider in order to allow them to do all of that scaling, have a lot of different analysts there. You don't have to worry about hiring. You don't have to worry about 24/7 coverage in a role that's notoriously difficult to staff. And so this then becomes an additional benefit from that MSSP. If you're paying attention, you should be absorbing some of the best practices from your MSSP. And I'm going to say as well that a lot of times when I talk to people who run MSSPs, they say, our customers don't do a great job actually following up on the stuff that we send to them. And they oftentimes don't do a great job on adjusting their own internal procedures to accommodate the sort of things that we could do to help them. They seem like they don't actually follow up on that very effectively, and they're always stuck in this loop. So one last little thing on outsourcing: make sure that part of what you're doing from that outsourcing is learning what that outsource partner does well, not necessarily even to insource it again, but just to make sure that you're most effectively absorbing the capabilities that they're providing to you, especially with the MSSPs that are there, right? So I want to go on and talk a little bit about the idea of alignment in our business. And the first aspect that I'm going to talk about this is use case development. I talk about SOC use case engineering to be able to make people understand that one of the things that you need to decide when you're actually running a SOC is what are the scenarios that we care about, because you don't have resources to care about every single scenario in terms of engineering that. And this is another place where your MSSP can help you, because they usually have worked on engineering lots and lots of different use cases and can redeploy those to you very quickly. When I think about building a SOC use case, I think about starting with business relevance and a scenario that might happen or that we've seen happen elsewhere in the world. Identify the characteristics of that scenario, break it down into a storyline, pull out potential artifacts. From those artifacts, look for detection opportunities where you might be able to differentiate something normal versus unwanted. Also look to threat intelligence and other correlation internal to your environment to help to make sure that you enrich that data so that you can then have a good detection opportunity. Then you implement it, then you assess that use case on an ongoing basis, and you review and revise this as you go. This is something that I think a lot of people fall down on this engineering aspect, and they think about it as a one-time push it out, but they don't build test harnesses around their use cases. I do hope that this is changing in the environment. I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but for me, the corresponding ad hoc, sloppy, sort of fast capability that corresponds to the use case engineering is the idea of threat hunting. And so I see threat hunting as a feeder to the things that you might actually end up engineering for your detections. Additionally, one other aspect I want to talk about for security operations is how do we align our staffing? And this is a huge challenge for people because they usually don't have a lot of staffing. So I'm coming up with three paradigms of the deployment of resources. One would be we have this sort of command center structure that is like the interrupt layer to protect the rest of the resources. And then we have specializations. This is the one on the top right, where we actually have staff roles who are dedicated to the command center, which is the customer interaction layer. We have monitoring capabilities, specific incident handling, staffing, specific forensic analysis, staffing, and so on. But usually what you have, and according to the SOC survey, the most popular size is 2 to 10 staff, and I'll mention that again in a moment. But the idea is that if you have only 2 to 10 staff, then everybody needs to do a little bit of everything. And usually if you have this pool of people approach, which is what I call this, everybody does that customer interaction layer, which I call the command center aspect. Everybody does a little bit of operational responsibility. They handle the phone calls. They do the calling out when there's a problem, or the emailing, or the chatting out. And then these other specializations, you do it usually based on what staff you have available, and people tend to sort of specialize in different areas. Now, one other architecture that I want to mention in terms of staff deployment is something which I call attacker phase mirroring. This is far less common than these other two strategies, but it's worth mentioning because I've seen it in enough places that people are organizing their staff in this fashion. The idea for this one is that the staff are dedicated to counter the adversary's capabilities. Now, the adversary's capabilities, we describe them in a couple of different ways. You might be using the diamond model. You might be using the Lockheed Martin cyber threat kill chain. You might be using the MITRE ATT&CK framework in order to describe adversary capability. And this is sort of a simplified view of consolidated across all of those different models: reconnaissance, delivery, exploitation, and actions on objectives. And so these 4 different buckets, you actually have defensive staff who are sitting inside of these roles, responsibilities. We don't care what technology they use. We don't care if they're doing monitoring or threat intelligence or incident handling or forensics or self-assessment at any given time. It's you must stop the adversary from accomplishing their recon, from their delivery, from their exploitation, and from their action on objectives. And so this is just sort of, an interesting strategy that I've seen people use to reasonably good effect.
And Chris, we did get one question that came in, which I think now is a good time to ask it. Mm-hmm. One viewer asked, have you seen SOC teams operationalizing the MITRE ATT&CK and defend matrices to focus security tools, processes, and spend?
Yeah, so really good question. So MITRE ATT&CK actually has in their original white paper a couple of things that you could potentially do with it. One is to do detection coverage assessment. So you can basically take all of the different capabilities that they're assessing are there and say, are we able to identify in our own capabilities that we could detect X? And it gets very specific in MITRE ATT&CK. And so you can provide a confidence assessment of your ability to actually detect any given thing. And if you do this well, after you've done your confidence assessment, then what you should do is what MITRE ATT&CK calls a defensive gap analysis. The defensive gap analysis then takes your assessed, usually self-assessed, but it could actually even be a third party assessing it, assessment of your ability to detect and intervene. And then you crosswalk that with the threat intelligence that's available through the MITRE ATT&CK program and other threat intelligence sources, basically indicating what things an attacker is likely to do to you based on the known threat intelligence that's out there. And then with the known threat intelligence based on the sector, or your own observed threat intelligence of attacks that have occurred previously, you then crosswalk what they're likely to do and where you have the least capability and confidence of intervening in their operations, and then you develop your use cases, detections, visibility, operational capability, staffing, and procedures in order to more effectively intervene in the adversary capability there, right? So probably the most tactical way that I've seen this deployed is that sort of specific intervention after a confidence-based assessment on your ability to detect and intervene, and then a threat intelligence informed crosswalk. Now, I don't actually see a lot of people yet using it in a truly strategic way, in terms of going all the way up to the board with MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I don't know that it's actually a good fit for that, to be quite candid. I have some other metrics that I prefer in that. But the fact that you're doing it and that you can show them that you're making progress on your tactical deployments, I think would be a good thing to actually represent to your management that you're actually doing. So
thanks, Chris. Yeah, I know we do have another session coming up tomorrow, actually, on this topic. So whoever asked the question, please do stop by the session. I think it's called Empowering the SOC to Drive Security Spending, and we'll go through that particular topic as well.
Cool. Yeah, awesome.
So
go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so we've got this slide here. There's a reason for it to remind everyone, please do join the quiz. I know that everyone has a competitive side, particularly in the security industry. So, so please do join this session where we'll test your knowledge on this particular presentation.
Yep, there's a lot of info in here, and so we're going to quiz you on these things that I've been talking about.
Exactly.
And so Kahoot.it is the URL. Put that in, then it'll prompt you for the number to join that specific quiz that Ben's going to be doing in a second. So it's 2548431. We'll get you into that quiz. I'm going to take it too. See if I can remember what I just said. So the place where I think everybody starts with their security operations center is they're like, hey, let's get a SOC. What do we buy? What technologies do we buy? And honestly, I really do not favor that approach. I don't think that you should start with technology. Nonetheless, technology is such a critically important part of security operations centers. And so in order to organize this and think through this, I have this technology taxonomy that I've developed. And this is something I've been working on for years, and I keep kind of updating and revising and adjusting it. And so what I do in order to make sense of this is I have these large categories: visibility, right? Communication, ops, detection and prevention, storage, deception, and analysis. So these are the big containers. Each of these containers has a set of subcontainers, and then each of these subcontainers has specific technology, and each of the specific technologies, I actually maintain example technologies in order to be able to discuss this. So this is sort of one example slide out of the RSA talk that I gave earlier this year on this, where I talk about the details here. So this is in the detection and prevention high-level container, and then inside of the endpoint aspect of detection and prevention, these are example technologies that I think that you should consider whether you need it or not. Write blockers, remote memory collection, local memory collection, an e-discovery agent, endpoint configuration analysis, host-based intrusion detection, AKA endpoint detection and response, AKA endpoint protection platform, AKA EDR, XDR, whatever you want to, like all of these different things, because the vendors, this particular one is like a pretty vendor heavy technology implementation that is available. UBA, user behavioral analytics, sometimes EUBA or EBA or UBA, depending upon what acronym the vendor is selected. Key escrow for encrypted drives, mobile device collection. This is all endpoint technology instrumentation that allows you to do detection and prevention. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that I'm talking about here. Now, with this enormous listing of technologies that you might consider needing, you also then need a way to manage this effectively. You don't have enough people usually to run all of this stuff, let alone do really good analysis across it. So my take on orchestration automation is it's phenomenal. It's really useful, but oftentimes what happens is people are so driven to get to orchestration automation that they start doing it before they really know what they're doing and what they can do. And then they end up deprioritizing things because they want to automate it rather than saying, hey, we should be doing it. In addition to that, they lose sight of the fact that we still want the analyst to do analysis. And I have this spreadsheet that you can download, and there are a couple of links at the end that I'll mention. You can grab the spreadsheet, which is my sort of brainstorming spreadsheet of here's all the processes inside of a SOC that I think should be present. And I'm talking about process procedure here in the context of technology, specifically because people put the technology first instead of thinking about the fact that we need to keep the analysts engaged and make sure that they're smart about stuff. And there's this thing that I talk about frequently in terms of the automation paradox, where we oftentimes take away the decisions from the analyst, exactly the decisions that we want the analysts to be making, until it's a critical moment in time and the analyst ends up sort of frozen because they don't have the right experience level to be able to do this well. So this is the sort of stuff that I think about when I talk to people about implementing orchestration automation, is what are your priorities for this? And how do you decide where to do this? And I ask people, just think about what you do. Even if you don't have documented procedures, take my list, start there, decide what stuff you actually do, and then prioritize which of the things would be good candidates for orchestration automation, which are usually the aspects of things that we do frequently that require a lot of precision, that have good technically defined implementations that we can work on. And of course, keep a practice of analysis in place for your analysts, because the analysts need a way to be able to show their thinking work. Right. And I talk about this in the context of analysis of competing hypotheses, which is from the Central Intelligence Agency, which is a description of how they actually think about problems as a team and document their analysis. Okay. And I don't have time to go into the details of analysis of competing hypotheses here, but you can go see some of the other talks that I've given around that. And so at the intersection of the technology, with the actual use of the technology, we have people. The staff is usually in a SOC on the scale of 2 to 10 people. This is the most common answer. And most of these much larger size SOCs, when looking at this data, they usually end up being managed security service providers, where they have a company size of 1,000 and 500 SOC analysts, because they're actually defending hundreds of thousands of endpoints. Okay, and so this is a circumstance where kind of the challenge for a lot of SOCs is that they end up just stuck in keeping the lights on, right? And so this is a way that we really want to make sure that our staff are doing the effective things. And so this particular eye chart is one where I have sort of a circuit diagram, a procedural depiction of steady state for security operations. And so with this, again, it's a little bit hard to see. So let me just go ahead and focus in on this. So we would have a little bit where these are the procedures that happen in my network security monitoring aspect, right? This is what the command center is doing, and this is the interchange between these different capabilities. And so for you, I don't know how you work. I hope you know how you work, though. And then if you had to draw a sketch of what you actually do, you could do that. And if you can draw a sketch of what you actually do, you can probably then get to that next sort of depiction of what it looks like, that I have a generic mechanism of depiction of procedures inside of a SOC with my structural layout of functional separation of staff. As you're operating tactically, you also need to think about the strategic operations of your SOC. What is the strategic influence on the SOC? You are probably pushed hard to develop use cases. Out of those use cases, you're probably reporting metrics. Part of the metric picture then gets folded back into how IT is operating, how they're changing. And you should be able to digest that information as well as the threat intelligence information that's changing in the landscape in an ad hoc fashion, respond to the threat intelligence that you're learning about to start to hunt. And those hunts should be driving your use case development. Out of all of this, you should consistently be pushing metrics out of the SOC. Do not push everything out of the SOC from the data that you collect. Focus on service level objectives and key reported metrics. And this is something that you really need to think about. What are the important reported metrics? Don't report on everything. Anytime that you represent a number, just a raw count, please provide some sort of moving average to go along with that. Anytime that you're talking about a time-based metric that you're reporting, make sure that you're also correspondingly measuring quality. This is something that I think people are far too focused on time. We want time, to be fast in our analyst operations, but we also want quality. And unfortunately, we frequently neglect that in terms of the corresponding picture because it's easy for us to report on time and it's hard for us to report on quality. So please make sure that your metrics represent both, because that's actually what your business cares about. And if they're pushing you to go fast, make sure that you're asking yourself the question, what are we doing to make sure that we're going fast and doing it really well? So here are a couple of links that I have in here. If you want to ask me further questions, you can either find me on Twitter at the Crowley Montans or LinkedIn. I rarely check Twitter, so LinkedIn would be the better place to ask me follow-on questions if you have specific ones for me outside of the context of this. But Ben has questions for you. All right, I don't think we have time to take questions for the audience. So Ben has questions for you.